Hi everyone, we are going to review Chapter 5, Exercise Physiology today. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you and pull up the PowerPoint presentation. So exercise physiology is the focus for today, and we're looking at the background of biological function of the human body. So what do your insides have an effect on your movement and how your body functions? We'll look at the physiological mechanisms of different systems in your body and how they relate to exercise. And then we'll look at key elements of how your body reacts and adapts to exercise stimulus so that effective exercise training can be prescribed. So an overview of exercise physiology, we're looking at the key elements of how your body, again, reacts and adapts. And we want to think of when you're exercising, there's usually a goal in mind. So am I prescribing the proper frequency, intensity, duration for that exercise session so that the client or myself, if I'm the one training, reap the benefits that I intend for them to reap. So here with interaction of body systems, so multiple systems work interactively. So as we move forward, think about that. When we look at the heart, we look at the lungs, the brain, and how they all work together to respond properly. With nature of exercise and the stimulus given to the body, again, we're looking at frequency, intensity, duration. We've looked at the FIT principle in the past, I'm sure. And we also want to understand how energy metabolism plays into the effects of exercise and the body. So the personal trainer, you're going to determine the frequency, intensity, duration to maximize the benefits for your clients. And then we want to think about exercise physiology definition in general is the study of how the body systems react to stressors, okay, of exercise. So you're taking into account the different systems, which are your cardiovascular system, respiratory system, metabolic, muscular and skeletal, and then lastly, neurological. So again, we're looking at the body's responses and its adaptations to stress. So that could be good stress placed on the body. We'll look at different terms later. So with that, you're going to have acute effects of exercise and you're also going to have chronic effects. So what are the long-term effects of this exercise program that I've written out for myself or a client or a group? And we want to focus on, of course, acute, but the long-term are very important because you want that client to sustain long-term progress and success. And of course, we want them to be able to continually see progression over time. Systems interact to respond to exercise demands. Think about how when you start exercising, your heart rate increases, respiration increases, and blood volume also increases as blood moves from the heart to the muscles worked. Your cardiovascular system is comprised of the heart and blood vessels. This is called a closed circuit, and the role is to deliver nutrients to and remove metabolic waste from the tissues. So that is the cardiovascular system's primary purpose. And lastly, to assist in maintenance of normal functioning at rest and during exercise. Page 135 in your book is going to continue to show you what the cardiovascular system does. So it's also going to transport deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs and then bring oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. It's going to transport oxygenated blood from the heart to the tissues and deoxygenated blood back from the tissues to the heart. And of course, it's going to distribute nutrients to the cell. So those include amino acids, glucose, free fatty acids. Additionally, the cardiovascular system is responsible for removing metabolic waste like carbon dioxide, lactate, urea from the periphery for elimination or reuse. It's also looking at regulation of pH to control acidosis and alkalosis. Transporting hormones and enzymes to regulate physiological function. It maintains fluid balance to prevent dehydration, and it maintains your body temperature by absorbing and redistributing heat. Figure 5.1 is here, and you have a picture of the anatomy of the heart and the direction of blood flow. Okay, so when we think about the heart, we've got to think about what it's surrounded by. And it's surrounded by the thoracic vertebral column in the back, your lungs on the sides, and your chest wall, which is your sternum and ribs in the front. If you look at that photo, you have 4 chambers that serve as reservoirs and pumps. So either the heart is holding on to blood or it's pumping out blood. The atria are your 2 upper areas, your 2 upper chambers, and the ventricles are your 2 lower chambers. Tissue coverings and layers of the heart. So your pericardium, it's a double-walled, loose-fitting membrane sac that covers your heart. Okay. The outer wall of the pericardium has both types of layers, a fibrous, which is tough, and a serous, which is a smooth layer. The pericardium helps anchor the heart within the chest. Okay, it helps it maintain its position. Your epicardium is the interior lining of the heart, and your myocardium is the cardiac muscle. It's the thickest layer of heart tissue. Okay. Connective tissue fibers support the myocardium and valves, okay, with the myocardium. On page 136 to 137 of your book, we go into chambers and valves of the heart. So you have 2 chambers, the right atria and right ventricle, and you have the left atria and left ventricle. Okay, these are your 2 pumps with 2 chambers in each pump. Okay. Your right atria and right ventricle are responsible for collecting deoxygenated blood from the body and pumping it through the lungs. That's called pulmonary circulation. And then you have valves. There are 4 valves. You have the AV valves, which include the tricuspid and mitral or bicuspid valve. And then you have the semilunar valves, which are pulmonic and aortic. And their function is to maintain blood flow in one single direction. The left atria, going back up to the chambers, the left atria collects blood from the lungs and pumps it to all parts of the body through the arteries. Okay, so we want to think right atria, responsible for collecting deoxygenated blood from the body and pumping it through the lungs. The left atria collects blood from the lungs and pumps it to the parts of the body, okay, through your arteries. Blood flow, we have different circuits, pulmonary and systemic. Okay, pulmonary is your right atria and right ventricle. Blood flow through the heart. Okay, systemic begins with the return of systemic blood flow from the body to the right atria. So the blood vessels, their functions are to deliver blood to the tissues, to promote the exchange of nutrients, metabolic waste, hormones, and others within the cells, and to return blood to the heart. It's called a closed system, and you have these list of terms. The arteries carry blood away from the heart, so think artery is away. Arterioles branch into capillaries. Okay, the arterioles and the capillaries are where the exchange of blood and other nutrients happens with various tissues. So think the digestive system, where the livers and the kidneys are. Venules join to form larger vessels called veins. Okay. The larger veins in the heart, think the vena cava, returns blood to the heart. So a side note, once blood exits the heart, it enters into the vascular system, which is composed of numerous blood vessels. To find different ways of cardiac function, we look at heart rate. So heart rate is how many beats per minute the heart is pumping. Average at rest is 60 to 80 beats per minute. Typically higher in women than men, higher in children than adults, lower in the elderly and fit individuals. Another cardiac function is blood pressure. So we look at systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. Okay, systolic is when pressure is exerted on the arterial wall during contraction. And then diastolic is how much blood is left back in the heart during relaxation phase. Okay, your average is 120 over 80. Anything with systolic exceeding over 140 or diastolic exceeding 90 could indicate hypertension. So definition of blood pressure, it's the product of the amount of blood pumped from the heart, okay? And that would be cardiac output. And the resistance of flow encountered in the vessel would be total peripheral resistance. So when the heart beats, blood is propelled into the left ventricle into systemic circulation. So it's going out into the body. As your ventricle contracts, force is exerted by the blood against the arteries. That is blood pressure, okay? And your blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. Cardiac function again, now we're looking at stroke volume. Definition is there, the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle in one single contraction. Okay. And it increases with exercise. You have it in diastolic volume and in systolic volume. The stroke volume is the difference between those. Okay. Diastole is also known as relaxation. Cardiac output, another cardiac function, and that is defined as the volume of blood pumped by the heart per minute. So the function is heart rate times stroke volume, and it's sensitive to body position. If you're in the supine or prone position, stroke volume increases. Okay. So typically the cardiac output for adults is 4 to 5 liters per minute. And it would be higher in an aerobically fit person. Acute responses to cardiovascular exercise. Mechanisms function collectively to support increased aerobic requirements of physical activity. So to support increased O2 demands. Okay. As exercise intensity increases, oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production by the working muscles increases. Okay, so oxygen delivery to working muscles is accomplished by changes in heart rate, cardiac output, stroke volume, blood flow, blood pressure, AVO2 difference, and pulmonary function. The cardiorespiratory system attempts to maintain cellular homeostasis. It's trying to find balance between O2 and CO2. Lastly, the central nervous system increases neuroventilatory and cardiac drive, which causes an increase in cardiac and respiratory muscle activity. This results in increased blood flow and airflow. Acute responses and heart rate with exercise, it's going to increase linearly as work rate and oxygen, okay, increase. And your maximum attainable heart rate decreases with age. Okay, we're looking at the heart rate is calculated 220 minus your age to find max heart rate. The magnitude of the heart rate response is also related to age, body position, fitness level, activity type, presence of heart disease, medications, blood volume, and environmental factors such as humidity and temperature. Looking at stroke volume as an acute response, this is curvilinear. So now instead of linear as heart rate increases, okay, now we're looking curvilinear. Okay, so it's curvilinear until we reach a maximal level of 40 to 50% of aerobic capacity. Okay, so that curvilinear approach is up to 40 to 50%. And at maximum stroke volume, you see an increase in oxygen demand that's met by the increasing heart rate. So a note, at very high heart rate, stroke volume may actually decrease because of the disproportionate shortening of diastolic filling time in the heart. Cardiac output increases linearly, and it depends on factors listed there. At lower intensities, cardiac output is controlled by an increase in heart rate and stroke volume. Therefore, increase in cardiac output results primarily from a continued rise in heart rate. AVO2 difference, another acute response. Okay, now we're looking at the oxygen extraction of tissues at rest and during exercise to exhaustion. Okay, so at rest, you're using about 25% of oxygen in the arterial blood, but with exercise up to 75%. Okay. So your AVO2 difference represents the amount of oxygen extracted by the tissues, and it reflects the difference between oxygen content of the arterial blood and the O2 content of the venous blood. Okay, so arteries versus veins, blood in both of those, and you're looking at the O2 content in both of those. Blood flow. At rest, 15 to 20% of cardiac output is distributed to the skeletal muscle, but during exercise, your blood needs to be distributed to the muscle. Okay, so at rest, the remainder is going to the visceral organs, the heart, and the brain. Okay, but during exercise, it's shunted away from the skin and internal organs to go to the muscle. Blood flow to heart rate max is 4 to 5 times with exercise, whereas blood supply to the brain is maintained at resting levels during exercise. Cool. Blood pressure. So systolic blood pressure increases linearly, just like heart rate with exercise. Max values are typically 190 to 220 millimeters of mercury. And the max values should not exceed 250 millimeters of mercury. If a person has decreasing systolic blood pressure, you need to terminate any exercise testing. Okay. Diastolic blood pressure goes down slightly or may remain unchanged with exercise. Okay. And the reason for that is because of the peripheral resistance caused by enlargement of the arterioles and the active muscles during exercise. Max O2 consumption. We're looking at VO2 max. Okay, that's your max oxygen consumption, and it's a measure of cardiopulmonary fitness. It's the most widely recognized measure of cardiorespiratory endurance. All right, we can use the Fick equation on page 139. Both central cardiac output and peripheral, which is AVO2 difference, regulating mechanisms affect the magnitude of VO2 max. So both of those matter. And VO2 max is defined as the highest rate of O2 transport, okay, and you're using, and that can be achieved at max physical exertion. Okay, moving away from the heart and into the respiratory system, we're looking at the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchial tree, and lungs. Your respiratory system is responsible for filtering the air that enters the body and allows gas exchange within the alveoli, which are microscopic air sacs in the lungs. Figure 5.2 shows the primary structures of the respiratory system. Okay, so looking at all of those different pieces, you've got an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. And control of breathing results from interplay of the brainstem and other respiratory pathways. Okay, so respiratory muscles lack the ability to regulate their own contractions. Okay, so that means the brainstem and other pathways control breathing. Okay, so the next two are the locations on your brainstem and cerebral cortex. So autonomic means automatic control, cerebral is voluntary, being told what to do. All right, page 141 illustrates this distribution of ventilation. You have an upper and lower respiratory tract. And with these, the upper tract is the conduction pathway for air into the lower tract. It's going to purify and humidify air before it reaches gas exchange units. It's composed of those four areas. Lower tract, you have 23 generations or divisions of airways, and it's controlled of those four areas. The ventilatory pump produces mechanisms for breathing and consists of these three: chest wall, ventilatory muscles, and pleural space. Go a little farther into these. Chest wall is composed of primary intercostal muscles, the bones of the spine, ribs, and sternum. And when you inspirate, more negative pressure in the pleural space and lungs than in the atmosphere. And at expiration, there's positive pressure generated by elastic recoil of the lungs. Okay. Respiratory muscles in the ventilatory pump. Only your skeletal muscles are essential to life. Okay, these are the only ones that are essential. Your diaphragm is your major muscle of inspiration, so you have to have these. Figure 5.3 depicts the role of the diaphragm in ventilation. The internal and external intercostals and abdominal muscles are used during active breathing. or in exercise. The internal intercostals and abdominal muscles are recruited to actively pull down on the ribs, okay, to allow you to breathe. So here is the diagram showing how the diaphragm works. Looking at the pleura, you've got visceral space, which is inner space, pleura space, and outer layer space. Page 143 to 144 can dive into distribution of blood flow. Okay, and there are about 5 different steps that I'll review for you here. But the first step is the pulmonary arteries contain systemic venous blood from the right ventricle and bronchial arteries. Okay, once you get to 2, pulmonary artery emerges from the right ventricle and divides into the right and left main pulmonary arteries. Step 3, pulmonary arteries divide into branches corresponding to the divisions of the bronchial tree and supply the pulmonary arterioles. 4, the pulmonary arterioles now divide into pulmonary capillaries that form networks in the walls of the alveoli. This is where gas exchange occurs. Okay, and 5, your pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from the pulmonary capillaries and converge into the main pulmonary veins, which empty into the left atrium. So with pulmonary ventilation, okay, it's known by VE, this is the volume of air exchanged per minute. Okay. Even though oxygen delivery is vital, pulmonary ventilation may be more regulated by requirements for carbon dioxide removal than O2 consumption. Okay, so even though it's vital, it might be more regulated by CO2 removal than actual O2 consumption. Ventilatory changes, so we see the larger lung volume and diffusion capacity at rest and during exercise. Adaptations from physical conditioning, okay, during rest and during exercise. Maximal ventilatory capacity may increase with exercise, but it is unclear that this provides any advantage other than an increased buffering capacity for lactate. Submaximal ventilation may decrease because there's a decrease in production of lactate that coincides with a decrease in the need to buffer lactate, which results in a decrease in ventilation. Page 144 discusses the energy systems, and we always start by understanding that food is our main energy source. Okay, so we have to break down and we have to eat protein, carbohydrates, and fat. You have anaerobic metabolism and aerobic metabolism. So anaerobic is without oxygen, aerobic is with oxygen. Okay, and in order to have energy, the food that's metabolized to produce it must be metabolized to yield the high energy compound called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. All mechanical work produced by physical activity relies on continuous supply of ATP. Manufactured ATP is stored in the muscles, so it's immediately available to produce movement when a stimulus is given to the muscle. However, storage is limited. So any movement lasting longer than a few seconds means ATP must be further manufactured. And that manufacturing is dependent on the exercise duration and the energy stores. Figure 5.4 is on page 145. Study this so you understand the exercise duration and intensity, which calls for this certain energy pathway to be used. So in the transition from rest to max exertion, the energy requirement of the exercising muscles increase substantially. Therefore, ATP must be constantly resynthesized to maintain the energy requirements of the movement. So as we look at metabolism, you've got available stores of ATP are limited, like we discussed. Energy production relies heavily on respiratory and cardiovascular systems for oxygen and nutrient delivery and for the removal of waste products, okay? And this helps maintain the equilibrium of the cells. Still on page 145, we can look at adenosine triphosphate, which serves as the ideal energy transfer agent that powers all of the cell's energy needs. So here, energy is released through hydrolysis of ATP, and hydrolysis forms ADP and inorganic phosphate. ATPase is the enzyme that is the catalyst. So the energy released through hydrolysis of the high energy compound ATP to form ADP or inorganic phosphate powers skeletal muscle contractions. The reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme ATPase. Creatine phosphates, that's another system that transfers high energy phosphate from creatine phosphate to rephosphorylate ATP from ADP. So muscle fibers contain metabolic machinery to produce ATP by 3 pathways. So one is your CP system, one is anaerobic glycolysis, and one is oxidative phosphorylation. So this CP is an anaerobic system, meaning no oxygen is in the picture. It's only for a few seconds. Anaerobic glycolysis lasts for just a little while. It's still using carbohydrates as the fuel source. Okay, there's no oxygen in that as well. But it can participate in aerobic production of ATP. So you can move from aerobic glycolysis to oxidative phosphorylation. So it can play a role. Page 147 has the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. Okay. A net yield of 32 ATPs from energy transfer during the complete oxidation of one glucose molecule in glycolysis. The citric acid cycle and electron transport. Then you have aerobic oxidation. So this is where O2 is available. You're using fat, protein, and carbs to produce ATP. And we're looking back at that Krebs cycle. Initial responses of exercise. Oxygen deficit is the lag in O2 consumption at the beginning of exercise. So at the beginning of your warm-up, okay, when you start to warm up, you're going to see that from rest to submax exercise, you're going to have an O2 deficit. But once steady state is reached, all the ATP supply is sufficiently provided through aerobic oxidation. At recovery, you have excess post-oxygen consumption. This helps restore creatine phosphate in the muscles and O2 in the blood and tissues. Okay, your muscular system, voluntary and skeletal, is produced physical movements. Okay, the individual can control that. Involuntary from your smooth is all internal organs except your heart. Another involuntary is cardiac, which is your heart. Muscle bundles are also called fasciculi in your skeletal muscles. You have the endomysium, and you also have the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is the cell membrane that encloses the cell contents of the muscle fiber, nuclei, local fat stores, and carbohydrate stores. Okay. So on page 149 is a picture of your skeletal muscle. Under muscle contraction, the sarcomere is the smallest contractile unit of muscle. We have the sarcomere, which is comprised of actin and myosin. On 5.7 coming up, we have the sliding filament theory. Okay, but both of these, sliding filament and all or none principle, are the two major principles that describe the mechanism of muscle contraction. Here we have sliding filament theory. Page 150 describes both principles for you. Types of muscle contraction, you have isometric. This is holding a position at constant length. So let's say a plank. Let's say a squat, sit, squat, hold, okay, isometric. Dynamic, now we're moving, okay, movement of a joint. This could be a lunge, this could be a squat, this could be a bicep curl. Okay, isokinetic means constant speed, muscular contraction against an accommodating resistance. So usually that's with a machine. Muscle fiber types are on page 151. Okay, there's intricate recruitment and switching, which occurs within the muscle over the performance of different or many tasks. And fibers designed to be optimal for one type of task can contribute to performance of another. So when we think of different types of muscle fibers, our net result is to train all of them so they're all efficient. You have slow twitch muscle fibers, which are mainly your aerobic endurance, low intensity type 1 muscle fibers. You have your type 2, which are fast twitch. So you have type 2X, you also have type 2A. Okay, that's your power and high intensity work. Lastly, we get into the neuromuscular system. This is the stimulus for voluntary muscle action using the brain stem, spinal cord, and specific motor unit activation pattern. Okay, page 152, a motor unit consists of motor neurons and muscle fibers that they innervate. Heavy resistance training affects motor unit firing, which is important. The skeletal system on page 153, you have the axial skeleton, which is your skull, vertebral column, and sternum. And you have the appendicular skeleton, which is your upper and lower extremities. Then you have different types of joints, which we talked about in chapter 3. Back to joints, active and passive range of motion, talked in chapter 3. And now back to the neurological system, the brain and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord helps control all of the peripheral internal organs. All muscular movement is controlled by the nervous system. So that means if everything is controlled by the nervous system, we have to understand neural control. So the body's central control center, which is the CNS, is where sensory stimuli are received, integrated, analyzed, and interpreted, and then relayed as nerve impulses to the muscles and glands for taking action. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the cranial nerves associated with the brain and spinal nerves associated with the spinal cord, as well as a group of nerve cell bodies called ganglia. The PNS is made of nerve cells and their fibers outside of the brain and spinal cord. Okay. The PNS allows the brain and spinal cord to communicate with the rest of the body. You have two nerve types in the PNS. You have afferent, which are sensory, and efferent. Okay. So afferent sends nervous system, efferent sends signals out to the body. So afferent carry nerve impulses from sensory receptors. Okay. And then the branches of the PNS, you have two. You have somatic and visceral. So the somatic regulates voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle. With the autonomic nervous system, now we're regulating visceral activities such as heart rate, digestion, breathing, and secretion of hormones. You have two pathways there, sympathetic and a parasympathetic. So your sympathetic is your flight or flight, okay? And parasympathetic just restores and conserves body resources. A few more slides here. Page 155 goes over neuromuscular control. Sensory stimulation is received through vision or touching and is transmitted to the CNS. All right, so nerve impulse, the term, is the information transmitted and relayed by the sensory and motor nerves in a form of electrical energy. Okay, so nerve pulse transmitted to targeted muscle through an efferent neuron for activating the muscle contraction. Motor unit activation proceeds from type 1 to 2A to 2X. So the motor unit is the functional unit of neuromuscular system. It consists of the motor neuron, again, and the muscle fiber it innervates. Other than the motor unit, okay, the muscular contraction is affected by specialized sensory receptors in the muscles and tendons that are sensitive to stretch, tension, and pressure. Okay, so read more up on the Golgi tendon organ. It's also on page 156. This is the structure of the Golgi tendon organ. Okay. And lastly, we go into exercise adaptations and different principles. So your overload principle, for improvements to take place, the resistance applied against a muscle must be large enough to impose a demand on the body system, thus creating an overload of the muscle. Okay, so the overload, you're going to mess with the reps, the sets, the load, and the amount of overload depends on muscular fitness of the person. Okay. Resistance training adaptations also improve aerobic enzyme systems. The increases have been reported in resistance training. We also see part of strength gain is also associated with the nervous system changes, and usually those are found in the early stages of training. More adaptations to exercise, increased aerobic capacity, reduced heart rate and systolic blood pressure, decreased lactic acid production and muscle blood flow. Okay, increased functional capacity of people with chronic disease. Resting heart rate decrease, stroke volume increase at rest and exercise. And you see a lot of increases and decreases with exercise. On table 5.1, you can see the physiological adaptations to aerobic conditioning in untrained people. Understand what changes happen. Women respond the same way as men, much the same, okay? So improvement is negatively correlated with age, habitual physical activity, and initial VO2 max. Improvements positively correlated with conditioning frequency, intensity, and duration. 5.2 for you to read, benefits of increasing cardiorespiratory activities and/or improving cardio fitness. And that is it. I hope that you have a great day and feel free to contact me with any questions.